Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to the continuing story of Pensacola, Florida, North America's first place city. In this series of episodes, we've been talking about the evolution of city government here in Pensacola, and we began by dealing with how such government began as an aldermanic system when the arrival of Andrew Jackson. We've carried the story through the early part of the development of the lumbering era. We've talked about the coming of the Navy and the military forts. We passed through the war between the states, and then, of course, the great awakening that we had here beginning with 1870 when the lumbering era began. Commercial fishing became a part of life. And then we carried forward into the 1880s with the coming of what I would call the utilities area, when we put in a water system, a sewage system, the street railways, the beginning of a manufactured gas system for street lights, the coming of electricity, and then, of course, the gradual movement to improve the commercial sector of the area, which, of course, required additional banks, which came on stream here, so that as the time we entered the early part of the 20th century, Pensacola was, I think we could just best say, a boom town, and we now, of course, had returned to an aldermanic system of government, and it was functioning well. We move into the early part of the 20th century, and I'm going to just sort of tick off a number of the things that began to happen here that were allied with growth, but were not necessarily a part of city government itself. Now, we had reached a point, of course, in the early part of the 20th century where there was need for adjustment. Because bear in mind that to this point, the city itself had not spent any money at all in terms of basic facilities for the city functions themselves. And so beginning in 1903, under the direction of the man who was then our Mayor Charles Bliss, planning went forward for these things. Number one, in 1905, a new jail and police headquarters was erected on the corner of Main and Jefferson Street. It was a beautiful new two-story building, a state-of-the-art for its time, with all of the amenities for prisoners, a fine headquarters for the police themselves, and upstairs, of course, was the courtroom on which the mayor himself or his deputy would conduct trials every morning of the week, 5 days a week. Three years later, 1908, the new city hall was built. Now, bear in mind, as we said in an earlier episode, after the return of the council after the Civil War, they had occupied office building, or offices we can call, or cubicles on atop of a meat market down on South Palafox Street. It wasn't much, and you must credit the city father to being very, very careful in their stewardship of tax dollars. They had their offices there. The alarm bell was on the top, and the city itself had been very, very frugal in its spending. But the new city hall was something different. It was a beautiful neo-Spanish style, which would stand in place from 1908 until the middle 1980s as the City Hall, after which, of course, it became the T.T. Wentworth Jr. Historical Museum. So the city had made this wonderful move forward, and as it was doing its building, we want to just list some of the other things that were going on around us. In 1903, a man by the name of Christian Thiessen had built a new 5-story office building at Romana and Palafox Street. 2 years later, a terrible fire swept through the main office block downtown, what we today call the Brent Block. It had destroyed many, many buildings there. And so right after the fire was over, when everything was being ironed out, as it were, the two principal owners of the block, Francis Brent and the attorney William Blunt, agreed that they would rebuild their bigger and better than ever, and they did. And as a result of that, what is today seen downtown as the Blunt Building and the Brent Building were the product of that reconstruction, and all of that was in place by the time we got to the year 1908. Now, at the same time, a pair of men who had been very active, very successful in the lumbering business, James Molden and F.F. Bingham. These men had traveled a great deal, and they said, now Pensacola itself is never going to be a really a growth city until we have a fine first-class hotel. And we don't have that. Now, we've got boarding houses, and we've got the Escambia House, and we've got the Manhattan, but they're not first class. And so at this point in time, these men put together the resources, the financial resources, and they purchased the property of what had been called the Palafox Street Methodist Church on the corner of Palafox and Garden Street. They purchased that property. They tore down the sanctuary and the pastorium, and they built the first stage of what became known as the Hotel San Carlos, which opened for business in February of 1910. Now, at the same time, one of the more recently opened banks, this was the American National Bank, which had opened here and operated from the old Opera House beginning in 1900. The stockholders and officers there decided it was time for them to open a new facility also. And so they purchased what was then called the Clubs Building, a 3-story wooden structure on the corner of Palafox and Government Street. They tore that building down and then began to build the 11-story tower, which would house the bank on the first 2 levels, then would have the remaining levels for professional office services. And that building was completed and occupied late in the year 1910. So all of these wonderful things are taking place parallel to what the city has done in its own structuring. And things went forward well. The city was doing its part. City council was doing its part. Taxes were low. The city expenditures were small because they did not find themselves entering into a broad area of services. To this point, and it's kind of interesting to note this, back as early as 1836, the city council had passed an ordinance which said that basically the city would be responsible through the actions of its chairman for the care of medically indigent patients. In other words, if they would take care of their medical bills, what they needed, the ordinance was very broad. And to this day, personally, I don't know whether this is the case or not, but to the best of my knowledge, I don't believe that ordinance has ever been repealed. So the city took on that obligation. But unlike the county, the city did not get into the hospital business or the care of the elderly and the infirm through all of this period. That was not to be a city responsibility into the early area of the 20th century. Now, what was happening, of course, within the city, we were beginning to see some of what we would today call the cultural agencies coming to pass here. In the early part of the first 10 years of the 20th century, with the city council concurrence and assistance in some cases, we saw the development of the Pearl Egan Home, which was the forerunner of what we today call the Children's Home Society. This was a place that took care of orphaned children who were left either through the death of parents or in many cases, unfortunately, they were simply abandoned. And that was the Pearl Egan Home came first. In 1903, the Salvation Army arrived in Pensacola and opened its chapter on West Government Street. The YMCA built its fine home on North Palafox Street at the same time. So all of these things were beginning to take form here as we move forward. Now, we move into the period of 1913. And this is a time of change in our city, and definitely involved the city. In 1911, the Navy Department had decided they no longer needed the Navy Yard. And consequently, in October of that year, the Navy Yard closed. The remaining 250 employees were furloughed, and the area was the yard, the 1,000-acre facility was simply put under padlock. We move forward just 2 years, and the city council itself has begun again to be under fire. Now, those who have lived in the area a long time can appreciate how this happened. People become dissatisfied with the way the governmental agency is functioning. Either it's too responsive or not responsive enough. And by the time we get to 1913, there are people saying, well, the city council, they're disorganized. They can't get enough done. We have other things that need to be done. And so these leaders went to the legislature, and once again, for the 4th time now, we are going to change city government. The charter is redrawn, and we now become, again, a commission system. And at this point, now we are going to have 3 commissioners, elected, of course, community-wide, and those men are going to fill all of the basic functions of city government. They're going to be the department heads. They will elect a mayor from among themselves. And the men that they chose, that the public chose for beginning in 1913, were retired wholesale grocer Adolph Greenhut, along with a man named Thomas H. Johnson, and a third man named Henry Heinrich. And these 3 men became the commissioners at that time, and just running the story ahead just a little bit, that the commission system put in effect then would serve Pensacola up until when we had moved into the terrible years of the Great Depression in 1931. Well, the new commissioners, they could take care of a lot of things that began to happen. Number one, within a year, the Navy decided to return to Pensacola. Of course, I don't think we can claim that the city council had a whole lot to do with that, but nonetheless, they did render assistance, as did the county, and we began the era of course, becoming the cradle of naval aviation, and the facilities on the west side were again occupied. At the same time, within a year, we have a brand new industry arriving in Pensacola, and this would become known as Newport Industries. Newport Industries was the first manufacturing industry, really, other than brick making or lumbering, that the community had had. Newport's mission was this: they had a process through which they would go out into the forest and dig up the old stumps that had been left there once the great pine trees had been cut for lumbering. They would bring those stumps into their factory, grind them up into chips, and those chips would be subjected to heat and pressure, which would literally squeeze from the stumps and the spent wood what we today call a basic naval store, from which could be extracted the materials for turpentine, rosin, and the materials for making printers' inks and paper solvents and so forth. So all of this was a new plant that was put in place along what we would today call South O Street. When St. Anthony's Hospital closed, it was succeeded by the physician-owned infirmary, not an appropriate facility for a growing community. But now physicians, the Catholic diocese, and the city combined to provide incentives, and the Daughters of Charity agreed to build and operate Sacred Heart Hospital, over 100 beds on 12th Avenue. We move into the latter part of the second decade of this new century, and the city council now was faced with the same problem that government all over the United States was. During the war, a movement had been resurrected that had been on the table for almost 30 years. And that was the idea of having prohibition. There were many women's groups and others who felt that the manufacture and sale of alcoholic beverages was had a terrible effect on many parts of the population. And so during the latter part of the war and immediately thereafter, the Congress passed the 18th Amendment to the Constitution along with the Volstead Act, which prohibited the production of spirits and their sale. Well, by the time we move into 1919, you can begin to see this effect on every part of government, because in Pensacola at that time, there were 26 different establishments which sold alcohol in one form or another, plus the wholesalers that served them. And this, of course, meant a considerable attack on the workforce, but nonetheless it happened. But it also, as that happened, it also brought into play another area which was much more a problem of the county than it was the city. But this began the era in which we had bootleggers operating out in the boondocks around the community, and that would be a problem here for the next 14 years. Now, going on but beyond that, of course, we move into the 1920s. The city council is still very interested in economic development, but they can see, as others can see, that we are now facing a time when the lumbering is about to come to an end. The trees are about gone. And so in 1925, the city council, along with the Chamber of Commerce and the Junior Chamber and others, participated in a large-scale survey to see what could Pensacola do to bring back, to find a new stimulus for economic development. And some things happened, but not really as a result of that survey. The two that would be most well remembered was, number one, the Newport Industry Plant entered into a new partnership with the Armstrong Core Company of Pennsylvania to build a second manufacturing plant alongside the Newport operation, and that new plant would make a form of insulating board and wallboard. And in almost exactly the same time, the old Pensacola, Alabama, Tennessee Railroad, which had several names in between, now was sold to the St. Louis and San Francisco Railroad, the Frisco. And so beginning in June of 1928, the Frisco Railroad began to come into Pensacola. And those who had been interested in economic development and had long hoped for an avenue all the way to the northwest thought, we have finally arrived. Our prayers have been answered. Everything is going to be absolutely up to date on our waterfront. That's where we were in 1930.